In the year 1968, the Vietnam War was in full roar, and the civil rights movement inspired thousands of minorities to speak up against discrimination. Protests and speeches had shaken nations all over the world. East LA was not excluded.
Members have been guilty of blatant discrimination against pupils. Mexican-American students presented a list of demands which challenged the school's alleged policy prohibiting the speaking of Spanish on the school grounds.
Mexican Americans faced their own struggles in East Los Angeles, specifically the Mexican American youth. In East LA, more than half of the Mexican American population was under 20, which meant young Chicanos who faced discrimination from schools also had a chance to make a mark in history. This mark is known as the East LA Chicano Student Walkouts of 1968. The blowouts, as students called it, brought triumph to the Chicano community as youth developed an identity for themselves that would follow them into empowering their future generations of successful Mexican Americans.
It's failure to communicate with the Mexican American. That is the disruption. When 57% of the students at Garfield drop out year after year, there has to be a problem. We're not operating in a vacuum. There's social injustice.
In East LA High School, 60% of Mexican American students were dropping out of school without earning their degree, and only 2% made it into college. These dropout rates were also known as the push-out rates, as young Chicanos were being pushed out by the discrimination of schools. Curriculums neglected to teach any Mexican American history. Students were forbidden to speak Spanish on school grounds, or they would face humiliating consequences such as being swatted. Quote, "We weren't allowed to use them before school, during lunch, or after school. We had to respect them. There were bathrooms, they weren't churches." Quote, "If some of the kids got into trouble and sent to detention, part of the detention was to become janitors." Classrooms were overcrowded with the average size of 40 students per room. Students struggled to find resources to broaden their education, but the schools did not deem it necessary, as Mexican Americans were seen as the lowest achievers in any ethnic group.
We have the lowest reading rate in East LA, in the East Side schools. We have graduates that graduate from high school, that graduate, that are in the 12th grade, that graduate and are out to face the world and can only read 8th and a 9th grade reading level.
And because of this assumption, students were coerced to settle for labor-intensive jobs without the possibility of reaching a 4-year degree. With their culture and opportunities stripped from them, Chicanos did not have an identity, as if they were lost between the culture that rejected them and the culture they were taught to be ashamed of. These oppressive conditions motivated high school students from Garfield, Roosevelt, Lincoln, Belmont, and Wilson to make a long-lasting difference in the schools and their communities. With the help and support of brave activists and teachers such as Sal Castro, a Mexican-American educator at Lincoln High, the Brown Berets, UMAS, United Mexican-American Students, were able to discuss plans to reform the schools. Students made a list of demands, some of which included allowing Spanish to be spoken, bicultural education, Latino teachers and administrators, smaller classes, better faculties, and the revision of textbooks to include Mexican American history. Students attended and spoke at school board meetings in hopes of having their demands heard. The demands were not met. Rather, they were disregarded. Chicano students then began to plan the walkouts, knowing the public schools would lose funds if students were absent from classes. Inspired by the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King's teachings, students were committed to a peaceful protest. With the help of Sal Castro, the Brown Berets, and UMAS, Mexican American high school and college students came together to organize and form the blowouts. March 5th, 1968, the start of the Chicano movement had begun. Hundreds of young Chicano students from Garfield and Wilson High School rushed out of their classrooms. The 2,000 students that walked out that day were shouting and cheering, "Chicano power! Que viva la raza! Walkout! Education, not eradication!" Students held their rights written on picket signs, eager to tell the world that they too deserve an equal education. And for the first time ever in American history, Mexican Americans had a voice, and it was powerful. We would not be ignored. According to Sal Castro, on that day it was beautiful to be a Chicano. The blowouts had just begun. Chaos, however, began to storm as a peaceful protest for equal education became brutal. Police arrived with clubs ready in their hands to forcefully push students back inside unequal schools from which they walked out of. Innocent high schoolers were beaten, clubbed, and thrown to the ground. Locked behind gates, chased by police, and some were arrested. Mexican-American students were treated as criminals. It was a riot. Police barked orders at students to return to schools, but students refused. Quote, just one of the many incidents of police brutality to befall high schoolers. The Times headlined the next day, student disorders erupt at 4 high schools, policemen hurt. The footage of police brutality and kids being beaten defenseless was never shown to the public. The blowouts nonetheless continued for another 4 consecutive days, although students were threatened with expulsion and had scholarships withheld from them. Mexican-American students stood their ground as they continued to peacefully protest for their rights and clashed with any opposing force. A total of 22,000 students had walked out from all 5 high schools, proud to be a Chicano. A week later, the school board accepted to consider their demands. March 28, 1968. There was a community meeting with the LA Board of Education held at Lincoln High School. The board accepted 2 demands out of the 36, more bilingual staff and smaller classes. The tragedy of it all was that most of the demands the students desperately pushed for were not met. According to the school board, either they did not have sufficient funds to comply or their demands were already being satisfied. The schools did not change as hoped, but the Chicano youth did. Mexican Americans had an identity they can be proud of, and with it they fueled and sparked the beginning of new possibilities for the Chicano community. This triumph led to the remarkable changes in young Chicano lives. Over the next few years, Chicano enrollment increased from 2% to 25%. The college recruitment of Latinos increased drastically, and students who had participated in the walkouts have pursued successful careers, such as Paula Crisostomo, one of the student leaders who later went on to become a student affairs administrator. Because of their struggles and efforts, groups such as Mecha came into existence in 1969 with strong activists who embraced Chicano culture while pursuing an education. After the 1968 walkouts, Mexican-American students will never be the same. The communities and activists will never be the same. Chicano students had changed a whole community with the walkouts. Although tragically their original goal was not reached, they pursued and gained a greater ambition, to be known, to be heard, and to be seen as a proud Chicano. And thus, a new generation of youth was born after the walkouts of 1968, a generation that is not ashamed to say, Yo soy Chicano.